All right, welcome back to Chapter 9, Race and Ethnicity. This is Episode 3. And let's just kind of pick up. There's a lot here at the end about dismantling racism and prejudice and what this means. I mean, when we talk about the impacts of or the consequences of prejudice discrimination, what's that mean? And I think it means some really huge pieces, right? It has a huge impact on folks' lives. So higher level of negative birth outcomes. So Black women 60% more likely to experience premature births. 230% more likely to die before the age of 1. Black babies are. Infant mortality rate, that is ridiculous. Black women more than 2 times likelier to have low-weight infants than whites or Latinas. So we look at social epidemiology, studies communities and their social status, practices, and problems to understand patterns of health and disease. And when we look along the lines of race and health, there are a lot of inequalities that lead to massive disruptions in people's lives. An amalgamation of racism stressors ranging from environmental pollutants, crime, poor health, leading to demonstrable deterioration of health, including poor birth outcomes, advanced aging, and even early death in many cases. So we've got to find a way, now that we know and we've studied what those inequalities are, how do we really do something about healthcare in regards to race as well? We know that healthcare, that's a whole nother chapter, of this textbook where we are trying to do some work, but it's been a tough one in this culture to get anything done in regards or in relationship to the rest of the world and what they look at for their healthcare practices and needs. Racial and ethnic groups in the United States today, multi-ethnic, multiracial society. We are increasingly diverse. We are just getting more diverse. There are places that are purposefully not doing that, like Russia, and there are places, most of the rest of the world, that are. And if we look across the line at administrations and sports teams and policies and groups, people are becoming more diverse. Non-whites make up 38% of the population, and they will be the projected majority by 2040, which used to seem like a long time ago. We all thought we'd have flying cars by now in 2020. Not so much, right? Majority of babies under 2 years old were non-white in 2010. And of course, migration is a primary engine of population growth in the United States. We have to address a whole lot of immigration and migration issues as well in this culture. And by 2050, 1/5 of the population will be immigrants. And an important percentage of the population in regards to just the very functioning of our society, and going beyond into culture and ethnicity pieces. All right. Do you have unearned privileges that make your life easier? This is not a guilt question. It's just a responsibility question. If we can identify the unearned privilege, maybe we refuse to take that unearned privilege, right? And then we start the process of making things more equal. Do you have unearned privileges that make your life harder? All right. Reducing prejudice. And this is a bit dry. I'm going to move fast, but no one really approach, right, that would be is going to do that, because there are a lot of different types of prejudices. So there are many infinite ways that people can be socialized. Therefore, one approach doesn't always work. Right? Approaches that work best vary from individual approaches, depending on the type of prejudice that's the main cause. Certainly, when prejudice serves to justify our discriminatory behavior, direct attempts to change it, we have to understand, are not going to be effective often at all. I mean, getting on Facebook or some social media platform and arguing with somebody who is exhibiting discriminatory behavior, it might work and often does in exactly the opposite ways. So each approach has to be geared to the individual situation. And that's why it makes it so difficult, because you can't just flip a switch. You think for now, some of the approaches flip switches for people, but those same approaches, Jane Elliott's blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise in the classroom or at work or whatever that might be, that's some people that's going to work with and turn on a light forever, and some people that's could cement that or those prejudices even more. Look, prejudice might serve some social functions, can't argue that, but it really involves invalid or irrational thinking. And this is the fantastic thing about prejudice and discrimination. It's vulnerable to attack because it's built on a mountain of garbage. It's built on a huge point of bullshit. Excuse me, but it is. And therefore, it's vulnerable to us being able to do something about it, to dismantle it. And that is positive and good news. So how have you in your life dismantled prejudice? Was it at a family gathering where somebody, an old relative, said something racist? Was it in a classroom somewhere? Was it with a group of friends? Is it on the streets involved in a protest? You name it. But you can think about in your life how you would or how you have dismantled racism. And then here's some approaches, right? But compassion, understanding, and education are really key. And we don't even know how subtle that is because we use violence in our speech all the time. That's another sociological piece. If we were in the classroom by now, somebody would have said, let me shoot you an email. And I'd say, just send me one. And people would be like, jerk. And I'd be like, yeah, sort of. But we kill tests. Students have said they rape tests, that people say that. You shoot people emails. This is the bomb. There is a huge body of wealth of information and research that shows how violent language helps in ways encourage us to sort of be blind to some of that violence and who experiences that in society. So compassion, understanding, education, and not using, or using at all violent language. Persuasive communication, right? Any communication that's specifically intended to influence attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So speech, a movie, a book. I mean, this course is designed to impart information, is not an example of this, but it's a gray area, right? Because you're wanting to be persuasive in the important information that you're passionate about, that you're presenting. So it isn't designed to do just that in ways. But to succeed with persuasive communications, it must be heard, must be paid attention to, and we ignore a lot of persuasive communications, right? Some people still are highly susceptible to that. But the message has to be clearly understood, and it has to be understood as an attempt overtly to reduce prejudice, right? Got to be a positive experience, seen as presenting a good idea. Messages have to be retained and internalized. Whew, oh boy, that's a lot of conditions for people to actually internalize a message and start persuasive communications as a way to deprogram and sort of disintegrate and break apart racism. So the source of the communication, content of the message, the process of the message, and the characteristic of the audience. All right. Look, we know people expose themselves to messages that they already believe in, what you click in, what you're used to. They know that, and advertising algorithms have all that down, right? We pay better attention to messages that support our viewpoints that we already have, and we look at them longer. We like things that reinforce ideas that we already believe. So we've got to be really smart and really clever, right, to deprogram discrimination. Most likely to accept anti-prejudice communication tend to be those whom are least prejudiced. The most prejudiced are obviously the most resistant, and therefore it's the most difficult. So the personality of the person receiving the message is massively important, right? Obviously, prejudiced people do not often think of themselves as prejudiced, and thus it's like somebody else's thing, right? I mean, we know we hear this all the time. And as prejudices become more subtle, the rationalizations become easier. And as we hear, like the term China virus, obviously a ridiculously racist way to say COVID-19 virus or COVID-19. We have so many scientific ways to say it. China virus, China virus, China virus, extremely racist. And so the rationalizations, the more you hear that, seem to become easier and easier and easier as some people tend to become more numb to those notions and even argue within that context that racism doesn't exist to begin with. So this approach works best as a way of reinforcing open-mindedness and reducing prejudice in people who are mildly prejudiced, right? The source is important. The source, look, why are so many people who speak about racism and race and deprogramming, Jane Elliott, Tim Wise, Howard Zinn, why are they effective? Because people are used to hearing, and people who are very prejudiced are going to hear a message from a person who is in dominant culture, a person of European descent, a white person, and listen to it more than they are willing to historically listen to people of color. So prestige, credibility, attractiveness, and power can influence how the message is received. That means that people who are of European descent and dominant culture who are doing important race relations work really have to understand that they'll never know as much as people of color have forgotten since breakfast, me included, and that they're an important part of deprogramming racism and prejudice and stereotypes, because the source of the message is important. And to dominant culture, people who are highly entrenched in racist ideologies, it's got to come from another person in dominant culture. All right. Intergroup education, very important. This is a big part, right? It does often have the impact latently of attempting or changing people's minds. And it's to teach rather than persuade. So if you're not trying to, but, and you're looking at intergroup education, fantastic opportunities exist. You can't make people feel defensive, and you can't challenge their ego too much. But if they feel like they're participating and learning new ideas themselves that might be contrary to old ones, pat themselves on the back, we're getting somewhere. Teachers make a huge difference. Look, minority folks are underrepresented in education. At the college level, fewer than 6% are African American and 4% are Hispanic. Looking respectively at the percentage of the population, they make up 13 and 11. There's certainly evident presence of prejudice in teacher and staffs, those that are mostly white. But, having a diverse staff is going to make a better staff and a more competent staff and a more capable staff. It's important that minorities are represented on staffs and teaching group. Materials for entire curriculums need to be as inclusive as possible and free from stereotypical portrayals of minority, as well as we have to continue to look at standardized testing and the implicit racial bias that comes along with testing like that. Intergroup contact, huge. When schools are more diverse, more interracial friendships happen. This needs to happen, and everybody benefits from it in education, employment, recreational, and many other settings. And we do see a lot of studies have shown us that reductions in prejudices, people became less prejudiced than comparable people living in segregated scenarios. You need to be around people of color. That is why CSU campus is so amazing, and it's so important that every college campus is so diverse, because CSU campus does not necessarily reflect the diversity of Fort Collins, right? We understand that. Studies show that heterosexuals have contact with members of the homosexual community are less prejudiced than people that have not. Intergroup contact, intergroup contact, intergroup contact. It can't be competitive, and we'd like it to be non-threatening, but the more you're around people, the more real and the more socialized you are to understand. Potential drawbacks you can look at here. Simulation exercises, right? Jane Elliott, the blue-eyed, brown-eyed studies. But that kind of brings us back to here. What earned privileges, unearned privileges do we have that make our life easier? How do those privileges make our life better? What disadvantages do we have, maybe based on gender or race or age? And how do those disadvantages make our lives harder, right? All right. All very, very, very important material. Thanks for sticking it out with me. I'm hoping that you're learning a ton. And I think that what you have learned and what we've learned collectively and what sociologists know about race relations, diversity studies, this brings us to a point where we can get closer together. We can create more equality, and we benefit from that diversity, just like a river does, just like the rest of life benefits all ecosystems from being more diverse. Human beings benefit from diversity of viewpoints, intergroup contact, and opening up ourselves to a more culturally pluralistic way of seeing the world. So be good people, do good things, everybody. Thanks a lot. Take care. Oh, cue the music.